Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our panelists and participants. Welcome to all of you following the conference, The Burden of Victory, the Second World War and its Consequences from the Perspective of 75 Years Since Its End. Today, it's 75 years since Nazi Germany signed the capitulation and bringing to an end one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of Europe and the world. Usually, when talking about the consequences of World War II, we think about the ravages, devastation, the loss of human life and material losses, but there are some consequences that have abided, some of which are still present today. I am referring to the political consequences of World War II, and there are at least two important aspects here. The first being that after World War II, there was no peace conference. Consequently, many legal issues had remained unresolved and unaddressed for many years, including border demarcation. And the second thing is that in World War II, the main victors were three powers, one of which was a totalitarian state. I am referring to the Soviet Union, which following the world, took over all of Central and Eastern Europe. These facts are not realized generally around the world, and during this conference we would like to talk about these lesser known but more enduring consequences of World War II. I would very much like to thank all our co-organizers. The main organizer is the Polish History Museum. I am the director of that museum, and also involved in this project is the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding, the European Network Memory and Solidarity, and the Museum of the Second World War. I want to thank our co-organizers. And I would also like to say that we had intended this conference to be an ordinary, huge conference at the Royal Castle in Warsaw. It was supposed to be a ceremonial event with outstanding historians and eminent guests. We were not able to hold this conference at the Royal Castle in Warsaw, but we can do this. At least a large part of the agenda can be done online, and I want to thank our panelists for agreeing to take part in this conference in the present format. Do follow what we're saying, and those who will not be able to follow the entire conference will be able to watch it on YouTube and on the website of the Polish History Museum. You can get back to the panels later on, and there will also be a television program on Telewizja Historia at 5:45 p.m., which will be an accompanying event. I also wanted to say that this conference has been financed by Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage, Professor Piotr Gliński, and we would now like to ask the Minister to say for a few opening remarks. I don't know if we have the Minister with us. Good morning, Deputy Prime Minister, and if you could say a few words to the participants of our conference. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers, panelists, and participants of the Internet conference, The Burden of Victory, World War II and its Consequences from the Perspective of 75 Years, a conference organized by the Museum of Polish History in cooperation with the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding, the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, and the Museum of World War II, inspired by the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage. World War II was probably the greatest political and military cataclysm affecting our continent. Only in Europe, 40 million people died not just on the fronts, but as victims of the Holocaust. and other genocidal action by the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, ruined villages in Warsaw, including Warsaw, which was burned to the ground, destroyed industrial and transport infrastructure. Hunger and disease are only some of the outcomes of this horrible war. In 1945, the reconstruction and rebuilding of European cities and industry began, but the capitulation of Germany and the ending of hostilities did not remove all the consequences of the conflict. Many problems were due to the fact that Europe was divided, whereas liberated states of Western Europe, like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, could enjoy political freedoms and rebuild their economy, benefiting from the Marshall Plan, among others. In Central and Eastern Europe were the scene of another act in the tragedy. The bayonets of the Red Army introduced a new totalitarian system. The Baltic states lost their independence, and Poland and countries to the south were subordinated to the Soviet Union. The media, the governments, culture, and even the economy were subjected to totalitarian communist authorities and its criminal ideology. In Poland, prisons, death cells, and exile was the fate of leaders of the resistance and home army troops who had fought for freedom against Nazi Germany. Was it liberation, or was it, as I believe, a new occupation? I will now be handing over to outstanding historians from Poland, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, and the UK. I believe that this will be one of the topics addressed today. The three parts of the debate at this conference on the consequences of World War II have to do with three important areas in which the consequences of the conflict have not yet been addressed. We could even say that here the war has not ended, even though it's been 75 years. The first has to do with historical memory in Europe, which is different in the West, different in Russia, and different in Central and Eastern Europe. The second has to do with certain legal disputes which have not been completed, even though it's been 75 years, such as the question of compensation or restitution of cultural property. The third part of the discussion will be about contemporary historiography and the way research and assessment of World War II has changed in recent decades. I want to thank the organizers for putting this conference together, and I want to thank the outstanding historians for accepting the invitation. I'm glad that despite the unfavorable circumstances, despite the pandemic, we are holding this debate. I believe that this online debate is an interesting precedent, offering an opportunity to open up a discussion for Polish and international audiences and to reach people living in remote parts of Europe and around the world. I want to wish you a fruitful and inspiring discussion. Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, for this address, as well as for financing our conference. Let me just say a few words about the organization of this conference. We have three panels, the first of which will be moderated by Sławomir Dębski, the director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. We will be talking about memory of the Second World War. There are different types of memory. There are at least three zones in Western Europe, each of which experiences the war differently. The first of this is Western Europe, which was liberated and which is celebrating VE Day. And the 9th of May is being celebrated in the Russian Federation in Moscow. But in Central and Eastern Europe, we tend to have mixed feelings with regard to this day, because for Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries, this was a day. This was a time when they lost their independence. It was, one could say, the beginning of a new difficult political situation and perhaps a new occupation. One could even say that we have been experiencing. The second panel will be about legal and political issues, for instance, compensation, border, and the loss of cultural property. The third panel, which will take place after a longer break at 1 p.m., will be about the historiographical discussions, the way the events of World War II are being discussed and what has changed in this discussion. And now I want to invite Sławomir Dębski, the director of the Polish Foreign Affairs Institute, to moderate this panel. Thank you very much, Director. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to welcome our panelists, Professor Andrzej Nowak from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, an outstanding Polish historian, commentator on history, and also dealing with the policy of remembrance. I want to welcome Mark Solonin, a Russian independent historian, author of many fascinating, great books about World War II that shed a different light than the one we had been accustomed to by Soviet historiography for 40 years after the conflict. And finally, I want to welcome, last but not least, I want to welcome Jonathan Walker, a British historian of warfare, of military issues, author of many important publications, one of which I want to mention here. Professor Walker has studied Operation Unthinkable, which was a vision to continue World War II, or maybe to launch World War III shortly after May 1945. And I'm also I'm very happy to have all of you gentlemen with us today. And this panel deals with historical memory of World War II, the way we keep returning to this war. It was a conflict different than World War I, fundamentally so, even though in terms of fatalities, more or less the same number of troops were killed. But World War II was different because it affected entire societies, not just the military. And it is remembered not by military historians. These aren't just recollections from the front. These are memories of concentration camps, occupation, memories of the racist policies which were intended to exterminate many nations, something that did not take place during World War I, something that was not part of the historical memory after World War I. We have a great tension. There is tension in the way we want to remember World War II. On the one hand, we want to universalize the experience. We want to say that people brought this on to people, to quote Polish writer Zofia Naukowska. People brought this fate onto people, but trying to make this experience universal is not consistent with the memory of those nations which had suffered the most, paying a tribute, celebrating the heroes, remembering the occupation, and standing up to the evil we had encountered on a mass scale during this conflict. I would like to begin by handing it over to Professor Andrzej Nowak and ask him to comment on that tension in the way we remember and should remember World War II 75 years after it ended.
Dzień dobry, witam serdecznie. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, and I would also like to use this opportunity and thank everyone for inviting me here. Let me start with something of a banality. 75 years ago, we did not need any kind of historical policy because actually everybody had their own first-hand experience on their threshold. Everybody knew how the war started and who started it. We did not need any clarifications as opposed to historical facts. Although it goes without saying that people who were subject to the National Socialist propaganda in Germany were most definitely provided with new facts concerning the purpose of the regime. It goes without saying that those who had been subjected to the Stalinist form of indoctrination had also been exposed to new reality, for example, following the Soviet army to countries that they had not ever had the opportunity to encounter. 75 years later, we are now encountering circumstances where we do not have that living memory anymore. So you can say anything you want about World War II. You can actually also generate the historical lie, a historical lie, and this is how the danger associated with the new situation is born. I do believe that the current historical policy or remembrance carries a new importance, not least because interest in the past and in history is dropping. So I do believe that we are fighting for an ever more shrinking piece or scrap of public interest. People are focused on something totally different. Now we have the pandemics at hand, but once it is over, we can remember, we can recall World War II as Quentin Tarantino would in *Inglourious Basterds*. You can tell a totally different story of World War II, and I do believe that mass or popular culture has a lot to say in terms of developing a discourse or narrative concerning World War II. Consequently, it can definitely be said that the historical remembrance has changed and historical remembrance policies have changed. The mass culture or popular culture is definitely a contributor. We have certain major players here. Russia, for example, at some point in her history after 1971, had been very conscious in following the Stalinist discourse concerning remembrance of World War II. 2005 had been of great importance. That was the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II, and the way it had been handled by Vladimir Putin, who tended to point out that this is the main point or main reason for pride, for public pride, which cannot be sullied by Molotov or any kind of claims by by West European or other European countries who had not been liberated but had also been to a certain extent enslaved by the Soviet army. It goes without saying that this discourse had been supplemented and strengthened by Zavtra, the historical Russian television, and obviously USA Today. And Russia Today, excuse me. So it is very important that voices of certain nations who had not been allowed to enter the discourse had been important as well. Central and European countries primarily. It is also hugely important that in 2004, when we had the new EU accessions, that was also the point of the fundamental or first scandals had broken out. Let us not forget when Sandra Kaliete had made an appearance during the book fair in Leipzig, and she recalled the experience of the Gulag as the experience of Central and Eastern European countries experience involving Poles, Lithuanians, Estonians, and so on. And she confronted that image with the image of National Socialism. This triggered a scandal, primarily in Germany. People tended to claim that you cannot ever juxtapose absolute evil with Hitler's heritage. And I do believe that the encountering such centers of memory of remembrance by everybody, including Russians who do recall gulags as crime which had targeted them as well. Well, I believe that this had formed part of a centralized front concerning the approach to World War II, and such approach has definitely become quite problematic. In the European Parliament had introduced a second day of remembrance, apart from Auschwitz, that is August the 23rd. That is the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact anniversary. People do not really pay attention to it. Nonetheless, the remembrance of and memory of the Holocaust has become, fortunately, quite the prevalent one. Now, let us ask the following question. What kind of dangers are carried by political approaches to World War II issues? Obviously, the fate of the Jews in the Holocaust being the primary focal point. Well, that, I believe, leads to a certain opening of the historical and political arrangement between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. You do know that the Russian president had visited Israel in January, in the course of which it had been emphasized that there is something that we might well refer to as a universal approach to the Holocaust on the one hand, and also the issues of the suffering of Soviet troops and their contribution to the conquering and overcoming of the Nazis. Now, it has been said that the Holocaust and the fate of the Soviet troops in Leningrad should be remembered. Nobody is negating that. Nonetheless, we should also mention other developments. What about Katyń? What about the moment of murdering, of assassinating more than 50% of Polish elites at a single location? Should we also approach that topic? And the third and final element I would like to point to is the German historical policy, which has been developing over the last several dozen years. It has been quite successful in view of arrangements with and relations with Israel in consolidating a belief that the Nazis were to blame, the Nazis without any kind of nationality, without any kind of real-time reference to a country that had actually sanctioned the system and had initiated World War II. I do believe that we are all responsible, all states are responsible for making the public understand what kind of dangers are carried by specific behaviors. Each of these huge narratives developed in historical policies, or historical politics, if you will, is built or developed against a point of falsification. And this is something I find hugely striking I find it kind of irritating to hear comments about the Nazis only. I believe that once you take a close look at the minutes of the Nuremberg trials or 1945 press accounts, nobody was referring to the Nazis then. Everybody was in agreement that the German Reich, the nationalist and imperialist policies of that state had resulted in divisions. Trams in Poland carried a notice nur für Deutsche, not nur für Nazis. So I do believe that this is something we ought to remember, also in view of what is going on in the popular culture. Whenever we take a look at the current cinematography, our attention is drawn to the cruelty of the Nazis and to the suffering of the Jews, very correctly so. Sometimes Russian or Soviet liberators are shown as cruel, but we are left wanting in terms of a focus on other matters. This is something that Sandra Kajete had been calling for. This is something that we are definitely missing, also in terms of the complexity of history in view of World War II. This is something that we ought to also remember in terms of what Brussels is doing when developing a history of World War II, because what we are fed is an image of the impact of Nazis on the history of Central Europe. Professor, since you will have to leave us in a minute, I would like to ask one additional question before we hand over to other foreign guests, distinguished foreign guests. You mentioned that the eastern part of Europe, only today, 75 years after World War II, has been provided with an opportunity of showing its own image of World War II remembrance. It is not only about Poland, but let me reference the Czech resistance or the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had invaded Finland in 1939, or the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. It is only now that we are becoming successful in shedding some light on such narratives. I have one question to you, Professor, if I may. Most recently, a major part of Polish remembrance had been made part of global awareness. Pilecki, for example, he is definitely an example of opposing universal evil. Rechman Pilecki had established an opposition movement. He was imprisoned and he escaped a camp. And after World War II, he was executed as an enemy of the state, as an enemy of the people's authority. Let me also mention the Ładoś group, a group of Polish diplomats and Jewish activists who had been falsifying and producing counterfeit passports throughout World War II. Let me also reference the history of the Polish Air Force. Most recently, the Polish contribution to World War II had received greater accolade, if you will. Now, I have the following question. Why are we doing anything and everything possible in order for these examples tying in with World War II should be finding understanding in the general narrative? Well, it goes without saying that it is easiest to reach the public imagination by showcasing the example of a single individual, a single history, a single human story. Now, once you identify a single face in history, that becomes the most efficient way of drawing the audience's attention. Hence, the universalization, however paradoxical that may sound, becomes the best way to engage the general public in remembrance. On the other hand, the examples you mentioned, Professor, are also serve the purpose of pointing out how difficult it is to change the international narrative. We know that, for example, in Poland, some people contest or oppose the referencing such stories. People claim that it leads to an unnecessary heroization of Polish wartime history, not to mention the narrative developed across Germany for the past 40 years or so, with regard to the blame that Europe overall ought to share with Germany. That is one of the scenarios that has been spun by the German as part of the German narrative. It can definitely be said that each and every example that we wish to bring World War II down to, however well or poorly it might be chosen, albeit I believe that Redmond Pilecki and the Polish Air Force that you mentioned, the Polish RAF troops, well, they are both these examples are definitely part of the European experience of World War II. The issues of the Holocaust or communism, the new ideology which had replaced National Socialism in terms of Polish and other countries' occupation, is focused in Pilecki's history. Now, the watershed during World War II had been brought by the Battle of Britain. Were it not for the Battle of Britain and the contribution of Polish troops thereto, World War II might have had a totally different result. So we do have certain points that we ought to be referencing, but we should not remain under the illusion that once we clarify these issues, we are going to come out into the clear and come up with a single clear picture. I also believe that as long as we argue about history, that will also mean that the history of World War II remains alive.
I oddać głos Markowi Sołoninowi.
And now I want to hand over to Mark Solonin, our Russian guest, our eminent guests, and as an introduction to his contribution, I wanted to share a story from about 15 years ago. I was attending a political conference, a German-Polish-Russian conference, and at the time there was the Estonian-Russian dispute regarding the bronze soldier. The Estonian authorities wanted to move this monument from a square to a cemetery. This was a closed political conference. It was very emotional. There was a clear conflict of remembrance and memory. And at one point, the advisor to President Putin attending the conference said, "But don't you realize that for Russians, the image of Soviet troops planting the Russian flag on the Brandenburger Tor, on the Brandenburg Gate, is a source of pride and is an important component of identity. The Russian state had never attained greater glory than in May 1945. So this tension between participation in the coalition that successfully suppressed the Axis countries, the victory of the Soviet Soviet troops, here clashes comes up against the experience of Central and Eastern European nations, where it was not just a liberation, but also a new type of enslavement, one could say. And how is Russian memory of World War II, how is this tension played out, evident? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Dembski, thank you very much that today, on the day of victory over Nazi Germany, I have this opportunity to share my thoughts and I think this is very important. The Second World War, which we are commemorating today, was unleashed by two dictators, Hitler and Stalin. They unleashed it together, but it ended quite differently for each of them. As Viktor Suvorov wrote, in the spring of 1945, Stalin, in his martial dress uniform, looked much better than Hitler's charred corpse. This difference had very practical implications. Hitler's burned corpse is no longer a subject of world politics. Hitler's body, Hitler's party, the Nazi Third Reich, Nazi ideology, all this has become an object of universal condemnation and oblivion. However, a different fate awaited Stalin. The Soviet dictator came out of the war in shining glory of the victor. He was not just a winner, but he was the main player, participant in the coalition of democratic countries. Stalin and his political heirs ruled a huge empire for 45 years after World War II. They had a lot of time and resources. Among many other things, they used these resources to create a deliberately false version of World War II history, which was thrust upon the people of the Soviet Empire, both inside and outside of the Soviet borders. There were government officials tasked with creating these propaganda lies. They were called Soviet historians with PhDs and professorships, though they made no bones about calling themselves communist ideology warriors. You might not believe it, but that's exactly what they called themselves, ideological war fighters of the party. The history they fabricated, I remember it well, and I think that many Poles of my generation remember the history as well. The Soviet Union was a peace-loving country. The Soviet people were busy with peaceful, creative work. The Soviet government was fighting for peace. The Soviet army was not ready. There was just one rifle for 3 soldiers. At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany perfidiously attacked this peaceful nation. In 1988, Soviet intelligence officer who fled to the West, Viktor Suvorov, published his book, The Icebreaker, in which he presented his version of World War II history. Let me briefly remind you what it was about. Stalin was getting ready for war. He had been getting ready for war ever since he came to power. The bloody collectivization of campaign, the famine, the forced industrialization, the Great Terror of 1937-38, the creation of the world's largest army, all these were stages of efforts to prepare the country for war. In the summer of 1939, Stalin decided to support Hitler. He supported Hitler like a rope supports a hanged man. Stalin helped Hitler start the war against a coalition of Western powers, the UK, France, and their allies, including Poland, so that the war could reach a much larger scale and both sides would bleed each other white. And then Stalin's army was hoping to march triumphantly against the ravages of Europe. 3 years after The Icebreaker was published, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Iron Curtain was brought down, and most importantly, Soviet archives were opened, not all of them, and not completely. But for the first time in half a century, it was possible to confirm or refute Suvorov's narrative with real documents and facts. So what did the documents reveal? My time is limited, and I have to make a very brief presentation of the outcome of the conclusions. And they are as follows. Every new document found in Soviet archives fits Suvorov's hypothesis like a bullet fits into a chamber. Today, it is no longer a hypothesis, it is a scientifically established truth. The information we have today allows us to describe with a great deal of detail, and we have a lot of information, a lot of facts, and we can describe all the elements of Stalin's preparation for invading Europe. We have weapon production, deployment of a giant army, operational plans, ideological preparation of soldiers and civilians for war, and additionally, we have many documents. These weren't just the plans on paper. In June 1941, the Red Army was in a state of strategic deployment, and in early July, it was preparing for an offensive. Or in late July, this deployment should have been completed, and the army would have invaded. Of course, this meant that 200 or 300 kilometers away from here in Lublin, Kielce, and Warsaw, Soviet troops were getting ready to push into Western or Central Europe. Of course, there are never enough documents. We need to work and persevere, but I am convinced that new findings in Russian archives, if and when such findings become available, will only confirm this version, this picture of the situation, and I believe that what we know today allows us to make that we have a new historiography of World War II based on the documents, and the Soviet Union can be said to have played an important role in starting the war. This new historiography is being done by a tiny group of Russian historians. I'm not going to waste your time on a detailed description of the conditions under which they had to work. In the 1990s, it was difficult, and in the last 10-15 years, it has become impossible. One should either stop being a historian or leave Russia. This is obvious, but not entirely interesting. What is interesting is, what did historians working in democratic Western countries do with all this information? So after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, they joined in the efforts. American and Western European historians rushed to Moscow. Former Soviet historians became welcomed guests at historical conferences. They were greeted with the words "dear colleagues" and "esteemed professor," and I was flabbergasted. I didn't understand what was going on. Did Western historians not realize, even though they were professionals, they specialized in Soviet history, didn't they realize that their colleagues were communist ideology warriors? Or perhaps they were brothers in arms, fighting on the same side of the barricade? The answer is obvious to me today. On both sides of the Atlantic, professional Western historians have joined in the struggle to deliberately save the intentionally false fabrications of Soviet propaganda. They are doing it with a passion that we didn't see in members of the Soviet Politburo. There were exceptions, obviously. Joachim Hoffmann, Heinz Magenheimer, Bogdan Musiał, Richard Rack, Albert Weeks, and Ernst Topich. My apologies if I've forgotten to mention someone, but again, as I said, it's not a very long list. If anything has changed in the last quarter of a century, it's the methods. Historians tried to argue with Viktor Suvorov. It wasn't difficult because Suvorov had expressed his hypothesis before the collapse of the USSR based on a negligible amount of sources, and his number of sources, and his position was vulnerable. Not all these sources were entirely reliable, and nobody's been arguing with Suvorov for some time. So total silence is the weapon of choice. There's no discussion, no objections. And in terms of the historiography of World War II, certain archival documents are being ignored. Nobody bothers, nobody wants to read these documents or comment on them. So the this is unprecedented. My time is running out, and I know that for many of you, my statement might sound unacceptably aggressive and inadmissibly politicized in content. Many of you might say that the war is long since over and the Soviet Union is long gone, and that we're living in the 21st century. An era of tolerance and pluralism. But in response, I would say that the list of crimes committed by Stalin's heir, successor Vladimir Putin, keeps growing. The invasion of Georgia, the war in Syria, the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in the center of Moscow, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London, UK citizen, the war against Ukraine, the annexation of the Crimea, the shooting down of flight MH17, interference meddling with the US elections, the attempted coup in Montenegro, the chemical attack in Salisbury, and the list gets longer. But I very much hope that one day, at some point, this list will come to an end and that our colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic will finally understand that the fight for the truth about World War II is much more than disputes about ancient history in far-off lands. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking part in our conference, in this panel, and this. And now, Jonathan Walker. And just an introduction to Mr. Walker's statement. Winston Churchill was one of the persons, one of the figures, one of the individuals who had put forward a certain historical narrative in 1940. The free world was facing an ideological enemy, namely Nazi Germany. And up until the last drop of blood, in the name of freedom, in the name of civil rights, in the name of individual freedoms, Churchill was resolved to wage the war until victory. But it was Winston Churchill who is responsible for defining the end of World War II, his famous Fulton speech, the introduction of the term the Iron Curtain, which has fallen across the continent and divided free and enslaved Europe. This remains a foundation of thinking about World War II. How is this tension seen as a British historian between the need for universalizing, the need for a universal discourse about the fight between totalitarianism and democracy? How is this reconciled with the need to discuss the true image of the war? How is this reconciled and how can this be done? Please.
Dzień dobry, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. I think the issue of the celebrations surrounding the victory in Europe in the Western capitals showed there were two very different stories. You had the people on the streets who were wildly excited. They were also exhausted after the years of war. They'd been fed a certain propaganda that the Soviet Union were a very benevolent regime and that they, of course, were our allies. So the people on the streets were hoping that things behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe would go well. The leaders in the West, of course, knew differently, and particularly Winston Churchill, when he gave his address to the people on VE Day realized behind the celebrations there were serious issues to be addressed. And he knew well we had a war in the Far East to finish, but he also knew privately that behind the Iron Curtain, things were going badly. But I mentioned Churchill because to most Britons, he is the towering figure of the war. His statues, images and speeches, as well as his vast literary output, are still very much in demand. And it was his sheer determination, especially in the face of terrible odds in 1940, which really inspired the British public. However, their opinion about other Allied leaders was more fickle, depending on the political mood. During the war, the British government had encouraged support, as I mentioned, for Stalin in order to maintain the alliance. But in the post-war period, the relationship cooled. Stalin's worst excesses during the war were exposed, and he became a vilified figure. An unfortunate side effect was that the enormous sacrifices made by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front were not properly acknowledged in Britain. The US-focused popular culture in the West has also tended to point public memory in the direction of the fight against the Axis in Western Europe. So, what influence have British historians had on the public memory? Most histories published in the immediate decades after 1945 used the general's view of campaigns rather than soldiers' personal experiences. This rather dry approach changed in the late 1960s when a new generation of historians emerged, determined to inject new analysis and excitement into their narratives. But they suffered one major drawback. For until 1974, it was forbidden to discuss Ultra, the top secret signals intelligence, which certainly shortened the war. The 1980s brought in a new generation of popular historians who combined lively personal testimony with often graphic descriptions of combat. And they were to benefit a decade later when access was briefly allowed to some of the Soviet archives. And in Britain, this allowed some serious revision of previously held beliefs. Now, while British historians may have expanded public memory of the war over the decades, novelists got off to a slow start. Often it took a feature film from a book to make an impact on the public. Strangely enough, the powerful war poetry, which helped shape Britain's memory of World War I, was largely absent in the Second World War. Perhaps Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon had said it all just 20 years before. But songs from World War II are still part of the national soul. No one portrayed the emotional wrench of parting and separation like Vera Lynn, singing "We'll Meet Again." And her words were even invoked recently by the Queen when rallying her country against a new national threat. Television became the medium for fact and fiction about the war, but probably the most influential production in post-war years was the documentary series The World at War, which was broadcast on the TV in the early 1970s. And this really brought the power of oral testimony to a new generation. The personal war experiences of a wide cross-section of ordinary men and women were heard almost for the first time, and their memory now became everyone's memory of the war. Television documentaries have also played their part in shaping the nation's memory of the Holocaust. However, there are issues surrounding this genocide which have largely been forgotten. Principally, the debate about why the US and Britain failed to act when presented with early evidence. Because the Allies have always been accorded the moral high ground, perhaps these issues have been avoided, but it has led to some erroneous ideas about Allied war aims. Britain's home front during the war left memories of cities shattered by bombing, yet she was saved many of the horrors endured by occupied Europe. The country was spared the desolation suffered by Poland or Ukraine, and neither did she experience the starvation of countries such as the Netherlands. There were no endless columns of refugees, nor the terrible widespread raping that was inflicted on German women in 1945. Britain was indeed fortunate that these events did not form part of her public memory. The female contribution to the war was barely recognised in post-war Britain, but the release in the early 1960s of feature films about female SOE agents changed this. Then the release of wartime SOE papers encouraged new books to be published on these irregular fighters. They appealed to the British love of a tough amateur battling against a superior enemy. They were heroines for whom a modern generation could identify. Britain's public wartime memory and her people's private memories can, like other countries, be selective. We choose what we remember and we choose what we pass down to future generations. Some of these incidents involve Britain's allies as well as her enemies. An example is the way in which the British held the Poles in high regard for their martial qualities on the battlefield, but little acknowledgement was given to the Polish for their contribution to Enigma. The Allies' failure to indict Stalin over Katyn was almost completely forgotten. Meanwhile, questionable Allied actions against the enemy were more easily downplayed in the national memory. The Allied bombing raids on Dresden in 1945, when it was clear that Germany would shortly be defeated, were rarely debated at the time. The main channel for private memory of the war is usually oral testimony. In the 50s and 60s, children heard family stories about life on the home front, as well as tales from fathers and uncles about their combat experience. In schools, eager children listened to teachers who had direct experience of warfare. The victors, of course, were always happy to talk. However, the memories were not always fresh, and the cultural overlay of too many decades can distort recollections. Though, because Britain was never invaded, families never had to contend with the moral horrors of collaboration. Nor did British children have to deal with fathers or grandfathers who may have fought on the Eastern Front, where atrocities were rife. And with the ease of digital information and the current fashion for tracing family roots, secrets will not last forever. There were few boys who grew up in the 1950s and 60s who did not relive World War II through their toy weapons and model aeroplanes. Their comics and magazines would be full of illustrated stories of British soldiers, sailors or airmen fighting stereotype Nazi enemies. The war loomed large in small lives. Strange then that British children of this era learned about the war mainly through their toys, films and television. Their formal history syllabus in school had little to offer, and history seemed to finish in 1939. Perhaps it was too close to the real events for subjective analysis, or it was not old enough to be called history. However, this absence was remedied in the early 1990s with the introduction of a national curriculum, which examined the causes as well as the events of the conflict. Students were encouraged to grasp the different interpretations of history, as well as exercising a critical view of sources. And it's hoped that future generations will learn that history can be viewed through different lenses and that there is no one absolute account. Then there are national occasions when surviving symbols of the air war are showcased, and it's a steely heart that is not moved by the sound of the approaching Merlin engines as the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters soar overhead, to be followed by the low throbbing of the legendary Lancaster bomber. And these are cultural icons that have become especially important in maintaining the sentimental memory of the war. So to conclude, with 75 years on, Britain's public and private memory of the war is still strong, and Churchill remains a towering icon of that period. But our society is now more multicultural, and the references that bound together Churchill's island race dissipate with every generation. Those who have direct memory of the war will soon pass away, and the conflict will no longer be a living family story. Instead, World War II will become history and inevitably lose some of its personal intensity. This 75th anniversary of VE Day is a time when memories of the war are broadcast nationally, and the self-sacrifice and duty of a previous generation is highlighted. If public and private memory serves a purpose, it is to keep those qualities alive and for the lessons of the war to provide a warning to those who will shape the world tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this absolutely beautiful intervention. I am going to open the floor for discussion pretty soon, and both Marek and Jonathan will be asked questions. Nonetheless, I would like to reference a very important sentence that Jonathan mentioned. Jonathan said that of the entire ocean of individual historical memories tying in with World War II, we tend to choose elements that we need. I believe that we need those elements, we need those components, and that also references the final part of Jonathan's speech. Well, these components are necessary in order for us to build a better world, to develop role models, and to point to persons and developments that ought to become an example for future generations. We ought to remember those who remained decent human beings, even in conflict. We would want everybody in our societies to be decent individuals. We seek out such examples of such behaviors. This is something we are interested in, and this is totally independent of the historical politics of states. We are aware of that in films, in movies, in literature, and also in quests taken on by historians who delve into memoirs and literature and documents and accounts in their search for such examples. Thank you very much. We have the first question to both our guests.
I think this is a question to Mark, primarily. What could Polish people do so that the Russian remembrance of World War II takes into account the Polish experience of World War II? This is a question from Agnieszka Kuchcińska-Kurcz. I think that, above all, maybe we should, or actually it would be nice, I think that's the best way to put it. It would be nice if Polish historians and commentators writing about the history of World War II should also address Russian readers and understand that Russia is not homogeneous. We have Putin's Russia, we have official Russia, we have the official narrative, which is very consistent with what was said in Stalin's and Brezhnev's. But we also have contemporary Russia. We have great people who were not poisoned by Soviet ideology. These are young people who are looking for sources of information, and they're asking questions to me and other historians. They want to find out what really happens. There is Western historians, the question is, how do Western historians see this? Do they corroborate what's being said by the Russian narrative? And every free country, and we can say that Poland today is a fully European country, it's a democratic country. So if these free countries join the effort to shatter the old models, then part of the Russian audience will hear this, and this is the part whose opinion matters to us. I think that there are people whose thinking is, so to speak, poisoned. These are the elderly, whom we can't change, but there are young people whom we can reach. Why was Poland not interested in Polish war graves in Germany, in which over 1 million Polish people, Polish troops, Polish people are buried? It's not a question I can really ask either of our panelists, but maybe let me try and rephrase the question so that Jonathan Walker can address it. Would you say that Polish historians, Polish society, perhaps the Polish community in the UK, do you think that they could do more to make that awareness of the Polish-British shared fate during World War II, or the contribution of the Polish armed forces or Poles to the victory, could it be better known, better reflected in a British historical memory of World War II?
Co można jeszcze zrobić?
What else can be done?
Sorry, are you addressing?
Yes, I would like to ask you, Jonathan. You know, there is I'm trying to reframe the question we got from the audience. So generally, my question to you is, what Polish historians or Polish publicists or simply Poles living in Great Britain now can do more to promote the understanding of World War II and Polish experiences of World War II in United Kingdom among the British colleagues?
Yes, well, I think the Poles living in Britain do a very good job at promoting what Poland did for the war. I think British historians could do more to concentrate on what was happening in eastern Poland. I think the story of the Polish contribution, for example, at Tobruk, could be more amplified. And of course, also the Polish fighting at Monte Cassino, we could hear more about that in Britain. I feel the Polish airmen that have been well celebrated for their very valuable contribution during the Battle of Britain. And that, in a way, is a battle that the British people can identify more with. I think the fight for the Polish homeland is a more distant idea for a lot of British people. But I think the people in Poland, through the Polish embassy and also institutions like the Polish Club in London, they do a very good job of inviting speakers and historians to talk about aspects of Poland's war. It becomes more difficult, of course, as the last generations are dying out. We had a number of camps that were set up after the war under the Polish Resettlement Corps, which housed communities of Poles who, although many of them didn't speak good English, they still were a presence in the homeland. I think the telling of the Polish story becomes harder when the older generation has died out and there isn't that direct personal testimony.
So I would like to follow a bit on that very briefly. Roger Muchhaus, who wrote a book, First to Fight, first book in English about September 1939 Polish-German campaign. wrote that this story was of no interest for the British public for a long time. Do you think that anything in this regard has changed recently?
Well, I think the whole event surrounding the outbreak of war in '39, it's a strange story in many ways, because Britain declared war because of the invasion of Poland, and yet she'd got absolutely no air power or land forces capable of sending to Poland to help in Poland's defence. So I think the West was just talking the talk rather than walking the walk. They hadn't got the capacity in armaments to do much about it, except throw leaflets out of aeroplanes. So I think it was very unfortunate that the Poles felt that the British and the French would offer decent assistance to help them. And of course, as we know, nothing came. I think the British interest picks up again after 1914 with the formation of the Special Operations Executive. And at that point, we can help the Polish underground. And I think that's the point where British do pick up. But I would agree with Roger Morehouse's thesis that this area is certainly neglected in Britain.
Thank you very much. Tak, mamy jeszcze jedno pytanie.
And yes, we have one more question. We have a question that invokes commentary. There is the claim that some say that World War II ended only in 1989 with the fall of the Iron Curtain. This concept, this term coined by Winston Churchill, the Iron Curtain, no longer described the political map of Europe. Are you convinced? Do you find this convincing? Maybe let's have Mark first. I fully agree with this point of view. I think that World War II really did end when the army of the second occupying power withdrew from the occupied territories, when the Red Army left the Soviet bloc, and those countries regained true independence, truly regained independence. The war came to an end in 1989, and I think it has to be said, we need to add that the Cold War I think that the Cold War is not a good way of putting it. We can't talk about a Cold War because people died. There was the anti-communist underground in Poland. We know how many people were killed. And during the Prague Spring, so many people were killed. Same goes for Hungary. Don't get me started about the Korean War or Cambodia and other countries. So I think that the Cold War is not the best term. It was a real war. People died. In some places, communism was successfully contained. Elsewhere, it wasn't. But I agree that for Poland and other Eastern European countries, the war ended in '89.
Question?
Well, the question from the public: do you agree? Because there is such the way of describing the end of World War II. Then actually the war ended in 1989 when the Iron Curtain ultimately collapsed and was disseminated. So. How do you feel about this kind of interpretation of the end of the World War II?
Well, I feel that perhaps in Britain, people at the time didn't appreciate what was going on behind the Iron Curtain because of this propaganda which had been fed to them throughout the long years of the war, and the business about Stalin being friendly Uncle Joe, a sort of benevolent figure. They really believed that perhaps things would not be too bad. Especially in Poland, they heard very few stories. They heard this new puppet government had been set up, but there were one or two perhaps liberal figures who might be put into it. And I think people hoped that things would not be too bad. They'd been starved of information because the alliance had to be kept together and we couldn't criticize the Soviet Union. So people were fed a very different story about what was happening. And of course, there was quite tight press control at the time as well. So stories about the laying waste of countries in Eastern Europe and the ravaging and the pillaging that went on were largely passed over. Britain, of course, had its eyes very much also on the war in the Far East, because although during Potsdam the atomic bomb was tested and found to be good and that was expected to be used in the war in Japan, they didn't believe at that stage that the atomic bomb would finish the war. They thought there would probably still have to be an invasion of the mainland in Japan, in which the British, of course, would be involved. So in Britain, we had our eyes still fixed on Europe, but also the finishing of the war in the Far East, which could go on for another year or two.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you.
Большое спасибо за участие в нашем очень интересном, мне кажется, панеле, Marek. Szanowni Państwo.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first part of our virtual conference. The discussion between a Polish, Russian, and a British historian about the ways we remember World War II 70 years after the end, 75 years after the end of the war, how this memory developed over the years, and why we should return, why we should continue to revisit these events. Now let's have a short break, and this conference promises to be fascinating, even in this virtual online format. It is a true intellectual feast. We resume at 11:30 for our next panel. Thank you very much.